Okay.
All right. Well, welcome. Thank you, David Mike, for joining us today on episode How to Turn Your Difficult Experience into a Powerful Story. I'm going to read his bio for you so you can get to know a little bit about him, and then we will jump into the discussion. So David Mike is a Christ follower, husband, father, author of Dishonor, One Soldier's Journey from Desertion to Redemption, and a cosmetology instructor in Omaha, Nebraska. David is passionate about sharing the message that we do not have to be defined by our past and that God can use our kind of mess for good. So this is just such a raw type of book, I believe. And I'm so glad, David, that you are joining us today to discuss the book and also a bit about your writing journey, what you went through as you were writing it and what you're currently doing even today as far as marketing and promoting your book. So one thing that I always like to kick off the podcast episodes with is asking our guests, what is one book in addition to the Bible that significantly impacted you in some way, either when you were a child or more recently as an adult?
Appreciate the time on your show, and glad that you asked me to talk about my story because it's one I think a lot of people need to hear. So, but to answer your question, there's a book that I stumbled across. And my story is a little bit about my time in prison, so kind of outed it a little bit there. But there was a book called Classic Christianity by Bob George, and I needed to hear the message that was in that book at the time of my life because I was really struggling with a lot of guilt and shame of the things I had done to get me where I was at that time. And the most impactful thing that I learned from that book was that anything that I had done in my life was covered by what Jesus did on the cross 2,000 years before I did it. And growing up in church, I had heard these type of things, but I had never really put that together. And it was kind of crazy because as I started to read through the Bible, all of a sudden it's almost like somebody rewrote it because I could see what Jesus did and how that affected me, and that I no longer had to live with the guilt and shame of my past, and I didn't have to continually keep asking for forgiveness all the time, and that I was completely forgiven once I accepted that free gift. So
that was definitely a very powerful book for you.
Yes, very powerful. I've given it away so many times. It's crazy.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And let's give our listeners a better understanding about the book that we're going to discuss. I'm going to read, if you don't mind, the back cover of your book.
Sure.
Okay, let me switch screens here. And one second, there we go. David Mike swore allegiance to his country in 1987, only to be dishonorably discharged for desertion. One bad choice after another landed him at Fort Leavenworth, a notorious military prison in Kansas, where he starts a new life as an inmate. Follow his journey as he claws his way toward Christ and away from the past that yearns to destroy him. Dishonor, One Soldier's Journey from Desertion to Redemption is a vulnerable and compelling look at a life gone wrong. With stark honesty, David gives insights into prison life and the shame that comes with living a dishonorable life. Through his raw, gritty personal account, he pleads for you to find the same redemption he found in his life. Wow. That, again, just reading that back cover is so powerful. And obviously, we want to dig into that a little bit. So what inspired you to write Dishonor?
So if you know me now, without knowing that I wrote a book or know my past or history, you would never know that any of that happened. And I teach cosmetology, obviously, as was mentioned before. Some of my students and parents of students we'd start talking about things, and all of a sudden, a piece of information would pop up about my past, and they're like, "Really? What?" I had no idea. You don't seem like the type to ever have gone through that. And so, the more that would come up in conversation, the comment was always, "You should write a book." And then I just kind of was thinking to myself, I don't really know how that works. I'm not sure how to write. It's kind of one of those kids in high school who didn't really apply themselves. So my grades weren't the best, but I was intelligent enough to get out of high school. So I just kind of worried that that would never happen, or I wouldn't know how to make it work. but it became overwhelming. And I also think that even though I was talking about my story from time to time when I was younger, it took a long time for me to be mature enough to handle the gravity of putting my story out there. But definitely it was an overwhelming, you need to write a book. And so I ended up pursuing that.
So did you struggle with any fears or doubts about sharing your story? Were you still, I know on your back cover you said about shame. Was that still an issue you had to work through?
Yeah, it was definitely something I was worried about. I was in the Army, and I had my entire family was in the military, so I had this guilt and shame and just embarrassment about not having completed my military service with armed conditions. And then after 9/11, my brother ended up he had just joined the Air Force. He ended up going to Afghanistan 4 times. And just the whole world was, pro-military, pro-soldier, helping others with using the military as a vehicle to do that. And I couldn't do it if I wanted to because of what I had done with my military service. So I was a little bit nervous about putting that type of information out there because I didn't know what kind of backlash I would get from people seeing me as the opposite of what was going on in culture. So I had to just trust God that if I was being led to put this story out there and for people to read it, that it would be okay. And so I just went for it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we're glad that you did. So one thing I think the listeners might be wondering is what exactly led to your dishonorable discharge, unless that's going to give away the story, because I want people to read this story. It's very impactful. It's worth reading. But I was looking at the look inside feature on your Amazon page, and it gives a little bit of a hint as to what happened. But do you want to share just a little bit, touch on that?
Yeah, sure. I actually blogged the entire book for 3 years before I wrote it. So the entire book was published online before it was compiled and published. And so it's interesting because I was also worried a little bit about, well, if you've already read it, who's going to read it? But if everybody bought a copy because they wanted to see the finished, obviously edited, and there was a lot of added information. But my story is that even though I was raised in a church and brought up by Christian parents and had a strong military connection because of my family history, and that's something I wanted to do for my entire life. Growing up, I prepared for that through taking ROTC in high school, which is like a military class. And just my goal was to be a soldier, and that was it. So I joined the Army and ended up in kind of a soured high school relationship that led me into a state of depression. I was out one night with a group of friends and ended up taking a hit of ecstasy, which up to that point, I had never taken any drugs or drank alcohol or anything like that before. So it was just kind of a new experience. And the drug was so strong that it started to overtake my life. I ended up needing to take it more every single weekend, and then even sometimes when I was at work. And I think basically it was somewhat the drug, but also me needing to numb the pain of real life. So I was in an artificial reality by being self-medicated. But being on drugs in the military doesn't work out so well. So eventually I ended up being under investigation from the Criminal Investigation Division, which is like the undercover Army police. But at that point, not only was I consuming it, but I started to get it so easily that my friends that I was hanging out with would say, "Hey, let's just give you the money and you go get it." So, I started basically selling and moving and moving the drugs around, and then I got caught. So once I got caught, the cop told me, "Hey, if you help us out, we'll help you out." And I did not take that advice, and I ended up going right back to what I was doing. Got caught again, so I disappeared for 6 months and ran away from the Army. And at that time, Panama was going on, so my unit moved to Panama when I moved to Houston, Texas. So hence the desertion charge. But the entire 6 months that I was gone, I basically sold drugs to make a living and just kept going further and further into a downward spiral. There's a lot of stuff that happened, and I detail all that in the book. But there was a moment when it was time. I was caught again, ended up in jail. And then the police officer who talked to me before decided he would help me out a little bit. And so there's a lot of stuff that went on with me working with them to get a little bit of a less sentence. But I ended up getting a 5-year sentence to Fort Leavenworth U.S. Army prison. And I went there, and during that time, God used that time to really get my attention. There's a few things that happened in there where God really showed up in my life, along me still trying to navigate life on my own terms, which worked sometimes and didn't others. Got out of prison eventually, came to Omaha, Nebraska, and ended up going to hair school, which is a passion of mine. Became a teacher, and then eventually have a family and all that. So things worked out. There's, like I said, there's a lot of detail in the books that I'm totally passing by, but that's the gist of the whole story. So
Right. What a wonderful story of hope and the amazing work that God can do in our lives, right? Even when we're not necessarily looking for it, that he can pursue us and show up for us in big and little ways. I love that story. So thank you for sharing that.
yes.
So since this Ink and Impact podcast is for writers, let's talk a little bit about the writing journey that you experienced. Is there a verse of scripture that maybe helped you shape this book or anything like that?
Well, there's quite a few verses in the Classic Christianity book, and I try to detail those without plagiarizing, obviously, but it's from the Bible. But the biggest one that stood out to me is Romans 8:1, where there's no condemnation for those that are in Christ Jesus. And having to deal with the fact that I was condemned by the government as a criminal, as an inmate, as a dishonorably discharged soldier, and all that goes along with that. I was released from that, with that verse, realizing that Jesus doesn't look at me that way. God doesn't look at me that way, and that I am a clean person in his eyes. And that was very therapeutic, and helped me get through writing the story, even though I had to go kind of back through my past and write out all of the bad stuff that I did. So
Yes. So when you're writing the back cover copy, which is so compelling, and you have a phrase that says, sometimes you have to be locked up to find true freedom, that's a powerful statement. So was there just an aha moment that that's the phrase that you need to highlight, or how did that come about?
So literally, I was locked up. But a lot of people are locked up in addiction and things that control them. And I think that had I not been locked up, I would not be alive. So it took me being stopped in my tracks, literally in prison, locked up, to keep me from continuing on the path that I was on. And sometimes we can't help ourselves, and God uses opportunities to get our attention. And definitely that was the one that I needed. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have made it out alive.
Mm. Mm. So when you first launched your book, how did you hope to impact your readers?
My biggest goal was I had a kind of a side goal. It's like people would say, well, what was prison like? So I thought that would be a good draw. So I told all of the story based on my childhood and how I got there and how I ended up in there, and then what happened when I was in there. And if you read the book, even though it's a Christian story, it doesn't feel like it till the very end. So I wanted to make sure that I didn't, hit people in the Bible with the face right out of the gate. It's okay to shine your light, but you don't want to burn people with it. So I, wanted people to be able to kind of feel like what it was like for me to go through that. But at the very end, I really wanted people to know you can be free. You don't have to live in the guilt and shame of your past because of the freedom that God provides for you. And I wanted people to be affected by that. And anybody who has been through what I've been through or is going through what I went through could feel like there was light at the end of the tunnel and that they were not alone.
So have you received some feedback from your readers? What are they saying? Have you reached that goal?
Oh, definitely. And I don't want to take any credit, obviously, because it was, even though it's my story, it's his story overall, but I've been able to get books into prisons. I had people family members of children who are in prison who would reach out and say that they have a better understanding of what their child was going through. People whose family members didn't make it out of addiction would mention that it helped them kind of understand the mind of an addict and what they were going through. I've had just lots of opportunities to speak to people about what I went through and how God redeemed me. And so it's been a real blessing. It's kind of cool too to kind of see where my book has ended up. Sometimes when the book first came out, people would take selfies of it in different areas of the world, and that was kind of cool. I didn't realize the impact and the reach that it would have. But it's just been an honor to to share and have other people affected by that in even small ways sometimes.
Oh, that's fabulous. We never know exactly how our books will touch people. We don't know who exactly they will reach, but God does, and he aligns those perfectly. And so that has to be just a wonderful feeling that yes, it was a difficult experience, but God has allowed you to use it for good.
Yes, thank you.
So I know you mentioned that school wasn't always your favorite thing, but have you always considered yourself to be a writer?
Not at all. I was more of a storyteller. So
Okay.
I was a military kid. When you move from one town to the next, or city to the next, because I moved, quite a few times as a child, you start to compare stories with each other and like, well, where have you lived and what have you done? And you're constantly trying to reinvent yourself, to the next group of people so that they kind of know your history. And that's kind of how it works as a military kid. But I've told stories my whole life, and I seem to have gotten myself into a lot of situations that, were either like the one I wrote about or some funny stories. And so I think I would say more of a storyteller. And so it was a struggle for me to actually write. And I joined a Facebook group, John Acuff started, called the Start Experiment. And I said, I think I want to write my story. And there was about 3,000 people in this group originally, and they were from all walks of life. All of a sudden, everybody just started reaching in and helping out with advice on how to go forward with that. And it's just been insane since then. So I'm thankful that I took that plunge and joined that group, because otherwise I don't know if the book would have ever come to fruition.
So did you choose to traditionally publish or self-publish?
I chose to self-publish so that I could have a little bit more control over the book. In order to get into a prison, it has to come from the publisher, but I had control over the rights and all that. I also chose a softback cover because coincidentally, you can't send hardback books to prison. So there's just a little bit more control over it. I wouldn't mind being picked up by a traditional publisher at this point, but I haven't really pursued it. So
right. So your book isn't a brand new release. How have you continued to grow your readership and reach your audience over the years?
I use social media as the main source of getting the book out there. Now that it's been about 6 years and I've exhausted probably all of my social network, I do from time to time post anniversary type items. Like it's been 30, I just recently, last year was my 30th year of being sober. And so things like that I would use as a vehicle to bring the book up again. But I do kind of have a little bit of a captive audience at the Harris School. So, there are students that come through and they're like, you wrote a book, and so then they're interested. And so there's a little bit of that. And then just anybody who has read it, who has felt compelled to share that story has done that for me. And I'm super grateful for the community that surround themselves around me and my book and help me get the word out there. So, it's not it's not being purchased as much as it was when it first came out, but I think I have surpassed the life expectancy of a self-published book by several years, and I'm super thankful.
Yes, that's great. So how have you seen God at work in your writing journey?
The first way I would say is that actually having to rewrite or write my story and go through my life, it kind of put where I am into perspective. So it helped me realize the relationship that God has with me, and where I am in my life now. Had I not, basically God chased me down because I was running from him big time. And so I don't think I realized the pain and suffering that I was causing everybody around me and the things I was doing to myself. So it was really eye-opening to go through all of that over again, but also just really the impact that, especially when the first book first came out, the impact that it had on people who read it, I was just blown away. And so I'm thankful that God has used me for a vehicle to share about his grace and redemption.
Absolutely. So what's one writing tip or encouragement that you can share with our listeners, particularly ones who are thinking about writing about a difficult topic?
Specifically about a difficult topic, I think the fear would be I'm outing myself and I'm going to be putting, something that's not comfortable out there. But one of the things I noticed that when I first released the book, people would come up to me and say, hey, I went through the same thing. And I'm like, oh, I had no idea. And then we'd talk about it. So they would tell me that they were thankful that they weren't alone. They didn't realize that I had gone through something like that. So I would say you don't really know who you're going to help. And if you keep it to yourself and don't put it out there, you're missing an opportunity of helping other people. So I would say just do it, put it out there. I do have another piece of advice. I would say just reach out for help, because if I hadn't had the village that came around me and helped me write and edit and just so many different aspects. I mean, there's a lot that goes into putting out a book, and I had no idea, but it just all came together. So I think God, number one, worked through that for me. But just the community of people that when I reached out and said, hey, I need help, and they were willing to do it, it was just amazing.
Yes. So being willing to share your story is step number one, and to turn that difficult experience into a powerful story, if I'm hearing you correctly, is just telling your story honestly and allowing God to work through that. Is that correct?
Yes. And you can change the names of everybody in the book if you need to, if it's something like that. I used my own name and my family's name, but I changed the name of everybody else in the book to protect the guilty and the innocent. So
yes, good idea. Yes. So where can our listeners learn more about you and Dishonor, the book?
So my website is dilemmamike.com. It's DILEMMAMIKE.com. And then all of my social media handles is Dilemma Mike. So you can find me on Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, all the socials at the Dilemma Mike.
Yes. And the book is on Amazon. Are there any other preferred sites, selling sites?
That is it. I have it on Amazon. Here's a copy of it. That's what it looks like.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us, David. I so appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for allowing me to use your platform. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.